and air defense crews have been at maximum vigilance for 72 consecutive days. UAE drone attack, Kuwait drone attack, bulk carrier struck and burning near Qatar, explosions reported in Iraq, explosions at Chabahar on Iran's Gulf of Oman coast, explosions at Bandar Abbas, again, and beneath the surface of the Strait of Hormuz, literally beneath the surface, Ghadir-class midget submarines flooding the waterway to hunt commercial and military vessels in the one operational domain where the air defense architecture that has been stopping 2,000 drones and 551 ballistic missiles cannot simply look up and engage. All of this in the same pre-dawn window. All of it simultaneous. All of it while Iran was submitting a diplomatic counterproposal through Pakistan that offers the most minimalist negotiating position of the entire conflict. And all of it while the commander of the IRGC Aerospace Force was telling the world that his missiles and drones are locked onto the enemy and awaiting the order to launch. Stay with me. Because May 10th, 2026 is not just another escalation in a conflict that has been escalating continuously for more than 10 weeks. It is the day when the operational character of this conflict changed in a specific and irreversible way, when the IRGC demonstrated that it has both the institutional will and the residual operational capacity to conduct coordinated multi-front operations despite the economic strangulation of the blockade, the military degradation of the Epic Fury strikes, the salary payment failures across the security apparatus, the storage crisis at Karg Island, and the accumulated damage of 70-plus days of the most intense American military pressure since the Cold War. And it is the day when a secret Israeli military installation in the Iraqi desert became public knowledge, killing one Iraqi soldier in the process, and introducing a diplomatic and security variable that nobody's operational planning fully accounted for. Let us establish the complete, confirmed operational picture before the analysis begins. The UAE Ministry of Defense statement. On May 10, 2026, UAE air defense systems successfully engaged 2 UAVs launched from Iran. The cumulative record since the conflict began: 551 ballistic missiles intercepted, 29 cruise missiles intercepted, more than 2,000 drones intercepted. That cumulative number is not an abstraction. It is the documented engineering and operational record of what sustained air defense against a determined regional adversary produces over 70-plus days. The specific consumption of interceptor inventory, the wear on radar and tracking systems, the fatigue accumulation in the human operators who are running each engagement, the maintenance demands on the equipment that has been firing continuously since February 28th, 551 ballistic missiles, 29 cruise missiles, 2,000 drones, and on May 10th, 2 more UAVs successfully engaged, adding to the record of a defense architecture that continues to function, but that is consuming resources at a rate that the $25 billion emergency arms package approved this week was specifically designed to address. Kuwait. The official spokesperson for the Ministry of Defense confirmed at dawn on May 10th that armed forces detected a number of hostile drones within Kuwaiti airspace and dealt with them in accordance with established protocols. Kuwait hosting American military base access since Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait reopened their bases in the current operational phase. Kuwait as a geographic and political piece of the Gulf Coalition that has been supporting American enforcement operations. And now Kuwait hit directly by Iranian drone attacks in a pre-dawn operation that expands the IRGC's geographic target set beyond the UAE, which has been the most frequently targeted Gulf partner, into territory that represents the deliberate decision to threaten every GCC member simultaneously. The bulk carrier near Qatar, struck and bombed, fire on board, another commercial vessel burning in Gulf waters because the IRGC fired at it. Not a military vessel, not an American asset, a bulk carrier, commercial cargo. Crew members exposed to fire aboard a ship that had nothing to do with the military conflict other than existing in the geographic space where the IRGC has decided that any vessel is a legitimate target. Qatar hosts Al Udeid Air Base. Qatar's Prime Minister met Vice President Vance at the White House just days ago, specifically to discuss the Iranian negotiations. Qatar has been the critical diplomatic backchannel through which every sensitive communication between Washington and Tehran has been flowing. And Iran struck a commercial vessel in Qatari waters in the same pre-dawn window it submitted its diplomatic counterproposal through Pakistan. The coexistence of those 2 events in the same operational period is the most precise available indicator of the specific institutional fracture at the top of the Iranian command structure. The pragmatist faction using the diplomatic channel, while the IRGC's operational commanders are firing at commercial vessels near the emirate that hosts that diplomatic channel. The Iraq explosions require acknowledgement that the full details remain unconfirmed even as the reporting suggests a coordinated component. Wave after wave of attacks across multiple targets in the same pre-dawn window, potentially including explosions in Iraq, would represent the geographic extension of the May 10th operation into a theater that has its own specific complications. complications that the secret Israeli airbase revelation has now made simultaneously more urgent and more politically charged. Now let us go to the submarines. Because the Ghadir-class deployment is the operational decision that demands the deepest analytical attention of anything Iran has introduced to the conflict since the initial ballistic missile salvos of February 28th. Iran flooded the Strait of Hormuz with Ghadir-class midget submarines on May 10th. Let that sit for a moment, and then let us unpack exactly what that means for the American operational picture in the Strait, and why it represents a categorically different challenge from every threat category that has been addressed to this point. The Ghadir is Iran's domestically produced coastal submarine, a vessel of modest dimensions, crewed by a small complement of personnel, designed specifically and exclusively for one operational environment: the shallow, narrow, thermally complex waters of the Strait of Hormuz and the adjacent Persian Gulf. It carries torpedoes. Some variants of the class carry cruise missiles in their weapon configuration. It has limited range. It cannot conduct extended ocean operations, cannot transit to distant theaters, cannot be employed anywhere that is not within its specific operational envelope of the Strait and its immediate approaches. This is not a weakness from the IRGC's operational planning perspective. It is a feature. The Ghadir was built for this specific fight, in this specific water, against this specific target set. Every design decision that made it incapable of open ocean operations simultaneously made it more optimized for the shallow water, confined area environment where it is now operating. The American surface combatant air defense architecture that has been intercepting 551 ballistic missiles and 29 cruise missiles and 2,000 drones is fundamentally an above-the-waterline system. The Aegis radar looks up into the horizon. The SM-6 and SM-2 interceptors engage threats in the atmosphere. The ESSM addresses close-in aerial threats. The Phalanx CIWS engages terminal aerial threats. None of these systems are designed to address a threat that is moving silently through the water 50 feet beneath the surface. The Ghadir submarines are not in the airspace that the Patriot batteries are watching. They are not in the radar picture that the Aegis systems are processing. They are in the water, beneath the surface, in a domain where detection requires completely different sensors operating on completely different principles from those that have been demonstrating their effectiveness throughout this conflict. Anti-submarine warfare in the specific conditions of the Strait of Hormuz is one of the most technically demanding operational challenges in the entire catalog of naval warfare. The strait is shallow, averaging depths that are genuinely challenging for sonar operations because shallow water creates the specific acoustic environment of multiple surface reflections, thermocline layers that bend and scatter sound, and ambient noise from the commercial traffic that has been transiting the area continuously throughout the conflict. The Ghadir's acoustic signature in this environment is not the clean, identifiable return that a submarine would produce in deep, quiet, open water. It is a small acoustic target in a background of hundreds of other noise sources. The mechanical sounds of commercial vessel traffic, the flow noise of the strait's tidal currents, the acoustic interference patterns created by the shallow bottom. Finding it requires sustained, intensive effort from the most capable ASW assets the American military has in theater. Those assets include the P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft, the Navy's primary maritime patrol and ASW platform, capable of deploying sonobuoy fields that create an underwater acoustic surveillance network in the strait, and processing the data from those buoys against the signature library of known submarine classes. The SH-60 Seahawk helicopters, operating from the Arleigh Burke destroyers, carry dipping sonar that can be lowered into the water at specific locations to actively interrogate the acoustic environment. The destroyers themselves carry towed array sonar systems that provide passive acoustic surveillance along their track. And the Virginia-class submarines operating in the deeper approaches to the strait provide the acoustic intelligence that only a submarine sensor suite operating in the same medium as its targets can fully extract. All of these systems are capable. None of them is infallible in the specific acoustic conditions of the Strait of Hormuz operating environment. The Ghadir's designers knew this when they engineered the vessel. The IRGC's operational planners knew this when they decided to flood the strait with them on May 10th. And the American ASW forces now managing this problem know it too. The Ghadir deployment does not produce a military parity between Iran's remaining naval assets and the American carrier strike groups, but it forces the American forces into a sustained ASW operation in the world's most acoustically challenging environment, consuming the attention and assets of the platforms that conduct that operation, and creating the persistent uncertainty about whether a specific commercial or naval vessel in the strait is operating in water that a torpedo is being guided toward. That uncertainty is itself a weapon. Every vessel operator who knows that Ghadir submarines are in the strait is making a calculation about the risk of transit that the surface threat picture alone did not fully produce. The IRGC's asymmetric harassment campaign against commercial shipping has been operating above the surface through drone attacks and fast boat swarms and coastal missile launches. The submarine deployment adds the dimension of uncertainty that operates beneath the surface, invisible to the commercial operators who are trying to calculate whether a transit is safe, present in the planning assumptions of every naval commander who is positioning assets in the strait, and impossible to eliminate without sustained ASW operations that acknowledge the threat and respond to it. Iran's diplomatic counterproposal is the document that removes every remaining ambiguity about the institutional position of the regime as it launches simultaneous multi-front attacks. The IRNA news agency reported that the proposed plan sent through Pakistan will focus at this stage on ending the war. 3 words in that sentence contain the entire diplomatic gap between the two positions at this stage. Those 3 words are the IRGC's way of communicating that the regime is willing to offer the cessation of current military hostilities while explicitly reserving its position on every structural issue that the American pressure campaign was designed to address. At this stage means not the enriched uranium stockpile of 400 plus kilograms, not the nuclear infrastructure, not the ballistic missile program, whose degraded but retained capacity the CIA estimated at 70% of pre-war inventory. Not the proxy network whose funding channels the blockade has cut, but whose institutional architecture remains intact throughout Lebanon and Yemen and Iraq and Gaza. Not any of those things. Just the war itself, stopped at the current moment, leaving in place every capability and every network and every institutional arrangement that makes the war possible again whenever the IRGC calculates it is advantageous to restart it. This is the specific outcome that the Secretary of State has described multiple times as the outcome this administration is trying to prevent. The deal that produces the need to go back in 2 years or 5 years because the structural problem was not addressed. The counterproposal from Tehran is precisely that deal. Cessation of hostilities without structural resolution. A pause, not a settlement. And it has been submitted through Pakistan in the same pre-dawn window that the multi-front attack was launched across UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, and Iraq. The coexistence of this diplomatic submission and this operational attack is not incoherent from the IRGC's institutional perspective, even though it appears contradictory from the outside. The IRGC's calculation is that maximum military pressure, applied simultaneously with a minimalist diplomatic offer, produces the specific negotiating dynamic in which the American side is more likely to accept terms that stop the immediate military exchanges, without requiring the IRGC to make the structural concessions it cannot survive institutionally. The logic is, if we hurt them enough, even the minimal offer looks attractive against the alternative of continued violence. The problem with this calculation is that it has been tested repeatedly in this conflict, and has consistently produced the opposite result. Each IRGC escalation has produced American military escalation rather than diplomatic accommodation. The tanker strikes were the American response to IRGC attacks on Project Freedom vessels. The Bandar Abbas and Keshem strikes were the American response to IRGC missiles fired at American warships. The pattern is documented and consistent. Iran escalates. America responds with force. No accommodation occurs. The IRGC Aerospace Force commander's public statement, missiles and drones are locked onto the enemy, awaiting the order to launch, is the institutional communication that accompanies the diplomatic counterproposal for the domestic audience that the information blackout has isolated from the operational record. The Iranian population cannot access the CENTCOM footage of the Sea-Star-3 in the Sevda. They cannot read the 45 square kilometer oil spill satellite imagery near Karg Island. They cannot see the cumulative IRGC failure record. 7 fast attack boats sunk, 3 major tankers disabled, drone launch sites destroyed, coastal missile batteries eliminated, naval headquarters struck. What they can access is IRNA reporting that Iran is submitting peace proposals from a position that does not require nuclear concessions, and state television broadcasting the Aerospace Force commander's declaration that the missiles are locked and ready. The performance of strength for the domestic audience and the minimum concession diplomatic position for the international audience are the 2 elements of the same institutional communication strategy, directed at different audiences through different channels simultaneously. The secret Israeli air base in Iraq's western desert is the revelation that every analyst who has been focusing on the Strait and the diplomatic channel has to now integrate into a regional picture that has just become significantly more complicated. The Wall Street Journal, citing U.S. officials, reported that Israel established a secret outpost in Iraq's western desert in the workup to the conflict with Iran. The United States knew about it. A forward aerial refueling point, a FARP, positioned in the western Iraqi desert to support Israeli air operations against Iranian targets by providing a forward refueling capability that significantly extends Israeli aircraft range and reduces the aerial refueling complexity that long-distance strike missions require. The operational logic of the FARP's location is clear. Israeli aircraft operating against Iranian targets, the depth of the Iranian interior, the nuclear sites, the missile production facilities, the command infrastructure, face the fundamental challenge of range. The distance from Israeli territory to the most important Iranian targets is substantial, Every additional kilometer of range capability, every reduction in the aerial refueling complexity of the mission, every improvement in the probability of recovering a downed Israeli pilot close to friendly territory rather than in the Iranian interior, all of these represent operational advantages that the Western Iraqi Desert FARP was designed to provide. It put Israeli combat support capability several hundred kilometers closer to Iranian territory than Israeli bases can provide. It created the rescue positioning that makes the risk calculus for Israeli pilots more manageable. And it was constructed covertly because its existence, if publicly acknowledged, would produce the Iraqi political and military response that is now occurring anyway, just belatedly because a shepherd found it. That a shepherd found it is the operational security detail that deserves more than the casual mention it has received in the initial reporting. An installation in what was assessed as uninhabited desert terrain, discovered by a civilian conducting ordinary agricultural activities, tending animals in a landscape that satellite imagery and planning assessments treated as empty. The specific failure mode here is the failure to account for the human presence in terrain that appears uninhabited to analysts working from overhead collection. Deserts are not empty. They have populations whose movements and knowledge of the terrain extend across generations and whose activities bring them through areas that military planners assess as isolated. The Shepherd's discovery is not a commentary on Israeli intelligence capabilities in general. It is a commentary on the specific operational security gap between building an installation in terrain you believe is uninhabited and building it in terrain that actually is uninhabited. When Iraqi military forces arrived to investigate what the Shepherd reported, Israel used airstrikes to push them back, and one Iraqi soldier was killed in those strikes. This is the specific action that transforms the FARP's existence from a covert operational asset into an active diplomatic incident with military dimensions. Israel struck forces of a sovereign nation, Iraq, that were conducting what Iraq would characterize as a legitimate sovereign response to an unauthorized foreign military installation on its territory. One Iraqi soldier is dead. The Iraqi government now has a domestic political imperative to respond to what is publicly documented as Israeli military action against its forces inside its own country. Iraq's domestic political landscape is uniquely complicated for this specific situation. The Shia political parties that hold significant power in the Iraqi parliament maintain close relationships with Iran, relationships that the IRGC has cultivated through decades of influence operations, funding, and political support. The Iraqi Popular Mobilization Forces, which have Iranian-linked factions, have been active throughout this conflict. The Iraqi government has been trying to navigate between its American security relationships and its Iranian political relationships, with the specific difficulty of a country that genuinely needs both. The killing of an Iraqi soldier by Israeli airstrikes at an unauthorized Israeli installation on Iraqi territory is the event that makes that navigation impossible to continue in its current form. The Shia political parties will demand a response. The Iraqi military will demand accountability, and the Iraqi government, whatever its private preferences, has to manage the public political reality that one of its soldiers is dead because Israel chose to strike Iraqi forces rather than evacuate or reveal the installation. The Apache helicopters visible over Baghdad and the fully armed F-18 being refueled in CENTCOM-released footage are the American operational posture in Iraq visible from the outside. Apaches over Baghdad signal that American forces in Iraq are at heightened alert, either in anticipation of potential IRGC-linked militia activity in response to the broader conflict's escalation, or in the specific context of managing the security environment around American installations that the multi-front IRGC attack has now demonstrated is under active threat. An F-18 with a full weapons loadout being aerial refueled is an F-18 that is about to go somewhere specific and do something specific. The CENTCOM decision to release this footage publicly is the same institutional communication logic that produced the CENTCOM footage of the Sea Star 3 and Sevda strikes, demonstrating capability and readiness to an audience that includes adversary intelligence services who are watching. The air bridge from Europe continuing to bring additional aircraft and supplies into the theater tells you that the American military buildup has not reached its ceiling. More capability is being positioned into an already heavily loaded theater. The specific nature of what the air bridge is carrying, aircraft and supplies of unspecified types, in the context of the Ghadir submarine deployment and the multi-front attack, creates the analytical question of whether the new arrivals include the ASIW-specific assets that the Ghadir deployment has made more urgently necessary. P-8 Poseidons deploying to Al Udeid or the Saudi bases would be the specific capability that the submarine threat requires, and that the air bridge might be delivering. Additional destroyer escorts with towed array sonar capabilities would serve the same function. The air bridge is bringing something. What it is bringing is what matters for understanding how the American force posture is adapting to the Ghadir deployment specifically. The explosions at Chabahar are the element of May 10th's picture that sits most uncomfortably between the analytical categories available to characterize it. Chabahar is not Bandar Abbas. It is not Keshem. It is not in the Strait or on the Gulf or in the primary zone of the American military operations that have been producing the documented engagements of the past week. It is on Iran's southeastern coast, on the Gulf of Oman, at a significant geographic remove from the primary operational theater. It is the port where India has been investing in infrastructure development, one of the few Iranian port facilities that maintained some international commercial engagement despite the sanctions architecture, because Indian strategic interests in the port's role as a transit point for Afghan and Central Asian trade provided a political justification for continued engagement. Multiple loud explosions in the Chabahar port area, with no official attribution, in the pre-dawn window of May 10th, the same window as the UAE and Kuwait attacks, the Qatar vessel strike, the Iraq explosions, and the Bandar Abbas blasts, produces the specific analytical question of whether the Chabahar explosions are part of the American or Israeli response to the multi-front attack, or whether they represent the covert operations dimension of the ongoing pressure campaign that has been producing the pattern of government facility explosions throughout this conflict, or whether they are IRGC-related activity at the port that produced an unintended detonation under the stress of the current operational tempo, or whether they are the specific category of event that Iranian authorities have been describing as gas leaks since the conflict began. The Bandar Abbas blasts, 2 of them early morning on May 10th, are less ambiguous in their probable category. Bandar Abbas is where American aircraft struck on May 7th. It is where drone launch sites, cruise missile batteries, and radar installations were targeted. It is the primary IRGC naval command hub for the Strait. Explosions there on May 10th, in the context of everything else occurring simultaneously, are most consistent with the continuation of the strike campaign against remaining military infrastructure in the port complex, or with the secondary explosions from stored munitions and damaged infrastructure that the May 7th strikes initiated and that have been working their way through the facility's structural compromised components. The satellite imagery of the tankers still burning and leaking in the Strait is the visual record of the blockade's enforcement accumulating into physical permanence. The Sea Star 3, the Sevda, still burning, still leaking, still visible from orbit, days after the F-18s from the George H. W. Bush fired the precision munitions that set them ablaze. That imagery is being watched by every Ghadir submarine commander in the Strait, by every IRGC Aerospace Force officer who knows the Strait's surface picture from the intelligence reports his command receives, and by every captain of every vessel in the global merchant fleet who is calculating what it means to approach an Iranian port in violation of the American blockade. The tankers are the message that CENTCOM delivered in precision munitions, and that the satellite record is maintaining in fire and oil slick for every hour since the engagement. Now, let us take the complete picture of May 10th and assess what it tells you about the state of the conflict and its trajectory. The IRGC has demonstrated coordinated multi-front operational capability despite 70-plus days of the most intensive American military and economic pressure of the post-Cold War era. It has introduced submarines into the Strait despite the sinking of its surface fleet. It has hit UAE, Kuwait, and a vessel near Qatar simultaneously. It has submitted a diplomatic proposal that offers nothing structural. It has declared readiness to launch at any moment. And it has had a secret Israeli installation on Iraqi soil revealed to the world, killing an Iraqi soldier and introducing a new diplomatic and security dimension that nobody's planning fully anticipated. The American side has maintained its defense architecture at 100% intercept effectiveness against every aerial threat engaged since the conflict began. It is continuing its air bridge reinforcement. It is maintaining the blockade that has disabled 3 major tankers and blocked over 70 vessels worth $13 billion in Iranian oil. It is processing Iran's counterproposal against the position that no deal that leaves the structural problem intact is acceptable. And it is now managing the Iraqi dimension of the Israeli FARP revelation alongside every other active operational and diplomatic thread in a theater that has more simultaneous active elements than any American military engagement in recent decades. Iran's counterproposal tells you the IRGC's institutional position with more clarity than any operational action can provide. Ending the war and nothing else. Stopping the shooting without addressing the enriched uranium, the nuclear infrastructure, the ballistic missile retained capacity, or the proxy network. The proposal that produces a pause and leaves everything in place for whatever comes next. This is not a concession. This is the IRGC telling the world and telling itself that it will not accept the terms that eliminate its strategic rationale for existing. And it is launching coordinated pre-dawn multi-front attacks simultaneously with that declaration because the message those attacks send, we are still capable, we are still fighting, we have not been broken. Or is the message the IRGC needs its domestic audience to receive at exactly the moment the diplomatic proposal creates the narrative risk that the regime is surrendering? The one way or the other has arrived at the specific moment where the way that resolves it will be determined not by what either side wants, but by which institutional calculation proves correct in the next 72 hours. The IRGC is betting that the multi-front escalation plus the minimalist proposal produces accommodation rather than counter-escalation. The administration is betting that counter-escalation against the multi-front attack, destroying whatever assets launched the UAE and Kuwait drones, addressing the Ghadir submarine deployment, continuing the tanker enforcement, and maintaining the absolute position on the counterproposal's inadequacy, is what produces the institutional breaking point that the entire pressure campaign has been building toward. The Ghadir submarines are the variable that neither bet fully accounts for. Everything above the surface has been addressed effectively. The undersurface dimension is new on May 10th. And the undersurface dimension's effect on the calculation of every vessel operator in the Strait, every naval commander managing force protection, and every diplomatic planner assessing the timeline of the crisis is the specific unknown that the dawn of May 10th has introduced into a conflict that had been, until this morning, operating in the domain of above-the-waterline threats that the established defense architecture had proven effective against. Subscribe and turn on notifications immediately because the multi-front pre-dawn attack of May 10th, 2026 is the operational inflection point that every analysis of this conflict's trajectory will reference as the moment when the IRGC made its institutional decision, not through diplomatic communication, but through simultaneous kinetic action across multiple countries, multiple domains, and multiple threat categories, about which way it intends to take this conflict. Drop your prediction in the comments right now. Does the Ghadir submarine deployment produce the first successful Iranian torpedo attack on an American or allied naval vessel? And if it does, what is the response that follows from the administration that has described the bombing at a higher level and intensity as the alternative to agreement? Does the Iraqi political response to the dead soldier and the secret Israeli FARP become the variable that introduces ground-level instability in Baghdad into a regional picture that was already at maximum complexity? And does